Hey guys, Loman02, currently doing a recording of deck tech and then some match analysis for this deck that you have in front of you, which is 4-Color Blood. I haven't gone back through and done a deck tech on this deck, and it's evolved significantly over time due to unbannings in the format, and kind of how I think the deck needs to be approached in the current meta, and also given the availability of some more powerful options inside blue. So the deck's mana base is the first thing you look at. It's exceedingly greedy. So this version of the deck, runs basically every single fetch land that is available, every dual land with the exception of the blue ones, down the line. Outside of that, it has all of the available man lands, to include Hissing Quagmire, Lava Claw Reaches, I believe Raging Ravine right here, Shambling Vent, and Stirring Wildwood. It also has the I don't know what you call these things, the tap lands, basically requiring you to have another land of one of their two types, quote-unquote, so they come into play untapped, as well as all of the, Copperline, Gorge, the two or less lands. One of the things I recently did was took out one of, I believe it's a Tri-land. I was not a fan of it. For a while, I've been considering playing Murmuring Boss. I can never remember the Tri-Land's name. It's the Abzan one from, I believe, Dragons or Khans of Tarkir. Instead, I put in Mana Confluence right here because I think it fulfills the same role and it comes into play untapped, which oftentimes is more relevant than the 1 damage, even if you take 1 damage over 2 to 3 turns. So this deck is a quintessential mid-range deck, and when I say that, I think the most apt title for mid-range is Switch Deck. Switch decks are capable of playing a control role against aggressive decks, generally to a better extent than even the control decks are, and it's capable of playing an aggressive deck against more controlling decks. In the mirror, obviously, your role is dependent, and frankly, in either of those two matchups, aggro or control or even mid-range, your role will vary, but your going-in approach should be pretty set. When you're facing aggro, you want to control, probably until turn 2 or 3, and then find a place to transition. Against control, you just want to hit the pedal to the metal and hit them with everything you got, which deck is pretty well equipped to do. So, as you see, 36 lands, so we could possibly go down to 35. We play many mana dorks, so Avacyn's Pilgrim, Birds of Paradise, Elves of Deep Shadow, Elvish Mystic. Down the line here, Noble Hierarch and Deathrite Shaman, probably along with Birds of Paradise, the two best dorks in the deck. With Deathrite's probably actually the best. In this deck, you have so many fetches. Generally speaking, if you're playing against multicolor decks, they're going to have a lot of fetches as well. And this card scales well in the late game because drawing it late is never bad. I mean, you can drain them or you can gain life if need be. It's not really irrelevant. Against Reanimator, it's good. So it's a great card. So in the 1 pile, we have Path to Exile, probably one of my least favorite removal cards in the whole deck, just because oftentimes when you want to be using removal against the aggressive matchups, you want to do it in the early part of the game so you don't take incremental damage and you can eventually get to your more powerful mid-game. This card allows them to cast multiple cards in a turn, which during that point in the game you're not as worried about overall card economy, you're more so worried about card efficiency, I think. At least this deck is. And oftentimes, in general, you are. So this card, I often am kind of loath to play, or I save it and try to utilize all of my other removal options that I have available until I can use this in the mid game, where the extra land drop's really not ramping them into anything relevant. Swords of Plowshares, not much to be said, just the best removal ever printed. Duress. So we did cut Inquisition of Kozilek, put it in the sideboard for the aggressive matchups and for burn or just control. But Inquisition tends to be bad against some decks, whereas Duress, I feel like in this format is generally tends to always be relevant. I rarely miss with this card, and even if I do, the information is fine. Inquisition is such a worse draw in the late game, whereas Duress is fine to draw. It's fine to have in the early game because it allows you to kind of set up the mid game. It's fine to draw in the mid game and or late game because if you're playing against control, they're bound to be holding something that you want to take out of their hand and they don't want you to take out of their hand, or it forces them to counter this as opposed to giving you the additional information. Fatal Push, one of the best Magic cards printed probably in a long time. This card is probably on power parity. Well, on power parity, given its flexibility and its ability to be cast in multiple different decks with Abrupt Decay, which was probably in the last 6 to 7 years one of the best removal spells printed. Kolaghan's Command's also up there, which we run in the deck, but we'll get there. Thoughtseize. So another option over Path to Exile that I often vacillate on is Ghastly Demise. Ghastly Demise is extremely efficient. This deck does fill up its graveyard relatively rapidly, but it's just not as unconditional as Path to Exile is, and sometimes it's a little bit of a workaround. Whereas Fatal Push just tends to always be live. It's obviously a better removal spell than Ghastly Demise, but Ghastly Demise is still worth a nod or consideration. Thoughtseize. This card, when it was allowed back in Standard, was kind of ubiquitous. It essentially, enabled the entire mono black deck. Most people will think Pack Rat when they think that deck, but Thoughtseize was really what was kind of holding the wheels on the boat, I think, or the wheels on the car for that one. Lightning Bolt, again, just ubiquitous with just great removal options. Quick pause, guys. All right, back at it, guys. So, Lightning Bolt, again, just, ubiquitous with just some of the best removal ever printed. It and Swords to Plowshares, first set. Why not? Jumping into the 2 pile, we start getting into our actual threats. So we really just have removal, and I guess you could consider Deathrite a threat, but the rest of the cards are just mana and or removal, and interaction with the opponent's hand. Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom is a great card in the mid-range mirror, as well as against control. Against control, it's pretty much either a must counter or a must O-ring effect. I guess they could vindicate it as well, but typically speaking, if you resolve a Bitter Blossom against like a blue-white or blue-red control deck, it's the death knell for their deck because it's very difficult to deal with. And, despite, seeing that it's just a 1/1 every turn, eventually this thing just turns into a monster. You get 4 or 5 of them down, and the parasitic damage that they accrue over time is pretty huge. Even if you're taking a damage a turn, it's not really that relevant. Or it doesn't tend to be. It comes out against red deck wins, so it doesn't really shine in that matchup because it's just not fast enough. It's very attritional and slow. But it's kind of a quintessential mid-range card that just hoses control. Dark Confidant hoses control again, great in the mid-range mirror. I don't even mind it against White Weenie, but against like the hyper aggro, like red deck wins, this tends to come out. But it is a card engine for 2 mana and it attacks, which means it's probably a card worth having in our deck. Arc Trail. So not on power parity with the 1 mana removal that we already looked at, but this card is a 2-for-1, and this deck is seeking to attrit opponents. It's a grindy deck. It's a grindy aggressive deck. It can play a grindy game, but it tends to be it can tend to be aggressive as well. This card right here allows you to do both. So remove 2 blockers, remove 2 threats, and allows you to race against decks that are common in the format, like White Weenie or Red Deck Wins. Even against Mana Dorks from the green decks, this card is pretty good. You can generally tend to snap off like a Fauna Shaman and a Mana Dork, or a Ruffellos and another Mana Dork, something like that. So I'm really a big fan of this card. Even if it doesn't look like much, you'll see it in the Vintage Cube, and I think it deserves its place in there. It has its time and place, and again, in certain matchups, it's just a huge beating. In this format where like you don't have power and combos not quite as broken in as it is in like Vintage Cube, this card just amazing. Always been a fan of it. Lotus Cobra. Huge amounts of ramp. So this is the one and I believe only Mana Dork that we run. I did remove the Sylvan Caryatid. Although the card is good against aggressive decks, I tend not to be as happy with it because it's just slow and it doesn't attack. Lotus Cobra can do it all. It can attack in a deck with like every single fetch land available. It makes just whole boatloads of mana if it's not dealt with. And it tends to be that in the early to mid game, this is like either a must counter or must kill for our opponents. Scavenging Ooze. This card, there doesn't need to be much said about it. If you ever played with it, the card is, I guess if you play with it, it's not surprisingly good. But I mean, now everyone knows it's good. But it's kind of insidiously good because it hoses combo decks that utilize graveyards as a resource, and it just grows out of proportion. So I mean, it's great versus control where you have like Snapcasters, Torrential Gearhulk, stuff trying to recurse things out of the graveyard, or Loam decks. And it's good against aggro because you trade your removal resources for their creatures. It tends to be at a 1-for-1 rate, but sometimes it's at a 2-for-1 rate. And you're using this thing to gain back life that you've lost in the aggro matchup, and also generate a threat that kills them. So the card is just bonkers in almost every matchup. Sylvan Advocate. This is kind of like a guy impersonating a Tarmogoyf. The card is okay. So for 2 mana, you get quite a bit. It's a Vigilance 2/3, which means it's good in the aggressive matchups. It's a good enough body in the control matchups. And if you never do anything but play lands again after you resolve this thing and it stays alive, then eventually your man lands are going to be huge, and this guy will get to become a 4/5, which allows him to actualize his Tarmogoyf dreams. Then there is the, I don't want to call it the man, the myth, the legend, but this thing, the Tarmogoyf, which, if you haven't played with it or against it, it's a pretty impressive card. It would never seem to be that way because it's a vanilla creature, but it just gets huge extremely rapidly, and this deck can make it big fairly fast. Tight Hollow Sculler. This card is great. So, it does die to additional pieces of removal, but the ability to attack the opponent's hand is very powerful, and it tends to be great in the control and or aggro matchups. In aggro, you're generally taking their best threat and forcing them to remove this so that they're less mana efficient and they can't cast whatever threat you take on curve, which tends to allow you to get into your mid game. Against control, it takes either relevant counter spells, wrath effects, or threats like planeswalkers that you don't have the ability to deal with at that point in time. So a very powerful card, and it comes again with a body. So most of our effects you'll see come with bodies so that we can use them to kill our opponent rapidly if we have to. Zoa's Persecution, I think the only combat trick in this deck, but it is indeed powerful enough that I think it deserves a place here. Where it shines the least is against control. It can be a one-sided wrath versus aggro, depending on what threats they're playing. And in the mid-range mirror, it tends to break the matchup, especially if you've achieved board parity and you conduct an attack. It can make some what appear to be decent blocks fairly horrendous for your opponent, especially when they're looking to do double blocks or triple blocks on your threats. Terminate, just great removal. I vacillate on leaving this in or out of the deck because 2 mana for a 1-for-1 is kind of a lot, but it's just that good that I think it deserves to be in here. Just answers basically anything. Abrupt Decay. This card does deserve its spot in here. Being uncounterable is nice, but the other half of it is it basically interacts with, in the 100 card Singleton format, decks tend to embrace efficiency. Any permanent, 75% of permanents in a deck, this is going to destroy. So it's Terminate on steroids. It doesn't deal with just creature threats. It deals with pretty much anything. And it's a great hedge against decks like Red Deck Wins that have Blood Moon or Sulfuric Vortex, because Blood Moon can just hose this deck if you allow it to, if you're not smart about playing around it or playing in a way that allows you to not die to it. This card can deal with it though. Grim Flare. This card's kind of a lightning rod. Where it shines the least is in the mid-range and the aggro matchups. It's very possible that we want to board this card, but against control, this thing is just a house. If you land it and they don't counter it, and or they're waiting to wrath the board, this thing is just, again, it's a Goyf impersonator. This guy is impersonating Goyf, and he's also fixing your top deck, which allows you to play around variants to a large extent. He's essentially a Sylvan Library with legs on him. That's a card we could consider for the board, but we don't currently have in here, but is a very good one in that matchup. Putrid Leech. Card's interesting. So the only place it really doesn't shine, extremely well is aggro, but even there it's not bad because it becomes a very good blocker against most of the threats that they're going to have on curve. Treating it as a 4/4 for 2 mana allows you to make some great blocks. Against control, this thing is a house because it's just a fast clock. Excuse me, guys. Putrid Leech just kills people fast. And against control, where they're probably not doing direct damage or threatening your life total until it's, the very late game, it tends to be irrelevant if you're taking 2 damage a turn off this thing. Lightning Helix. Obviously not great versus control, but pretty much good in every other matchup. Mid-range and aggro. Aggro allows you to race and remove a relevant threat. In mid-range, same thing basically, or it allows you to complement some first strikers, to take down much larger threats. Dromoka's Command. This card is kind of a Swiss Army knife and is one of my favorite cards in this deck. It allows you to play around Price of Progress. It allows you to deal with Blood Moon and or Sulfuric Vortex. It allows you to win in combat, generally speaking if they've tapped out and you don't believe they have removal. Allows you to get their most relevant threat. It just does an awful lot in a lot of matchups. So this card is an all-star in pretty much every matchup. The only matchups I'd say it doesn't shine is maybe control, but even there, if they play a Humility or a Moat, this thing can just, one, bump up your threat and then allow you to do a lot of damage out of nowhere they probably weren't expecting if they're playing cards like those. Fleetsbane Lion, just a lot of body for a very little amount of mana, and the ultimate on it, or the monstrosity 1 on it, is not irrelevant. I have done it before in this deck, although it's not common. Typically speaking, if you're doing that, you're playing against control, and you're just trying to limit the amount of threats that you expose to mass removal, or multiple for 1 card advantage removal. And if you ever get this guy to monstrosity, really the only thing that's going to deal with it is going to be Council's Judgment, or an Edict Effect, or Terminus. I guess Hallowed Burial, but I rarely ever see that card played. So it's just not a lot that deals with it once it's ultimated. I guess you could block it as well with just a bigger body. That's another option. Kasali Primate Mage. This card turns mana dorks into threats, turns itself into a threat. I mean, it's essentially a 3/3 attacker. Unless you're on like a flooded board, at which point like you're already doing well anyways. And the fact that it can just exchange itself to deal with any enchantment or artifact makes this card just a huge boon, and one of the better 2-drops in the deck. Voice of Resurgence. This card again is kind of a Swiss Army knife. So where it's ostensibly going to shine is against control or any deck that's trying to play a lot of permission. Because if they're countering your spells, that's cool because you're still getting like a 4/4 or 5/5 or a 6/6. You're still gaining inevitability. Like and you're sometimes I've had opponents counter my spells, and like I personally feel that like the 4/4 or the 5/5 that I get from Voice of Resurgence is just better than whatever I was even casting. They should have just let it resolve. That said, this is also not bad in aggro because you can generally trade it for one threat and then get another threat out of it that can either block again or can become another attacker. So it's basically just a 2-for-1 advantage against aggressive decks. Aven Mind Sensor would never probably remove this guy. I mean, I bored him out against certain matchups like White Weenie or Red Deck Wins. But in the mirror, this card is a breaker. Against anything that plays a lot of fetch lands, it's a breaker. And then against like combo or control decks, he's still very good because he plays around counter magic to a higher extent than non-flash creatures. And they're generally tending to play like cards like Mystical Teachings, like Mystical Tutor, like Demonic Tutor if it was allowed in the format, but there's quite a few that it can get to also include the fetch lands. Lingering Souls just destroys. Like this card is good in every matchup. Great in mid range where you want to race and your opponent is just trading their attacks for 1/1 tokens. Good versus aggro because it just generally trades with their creatures at like a 2 to 3-for-1 rate. And then good versus control because no one wants to counter this thing. You counter it and then you just flash it back for 2 mana and you have the 2/2s. And you may not think it, but for a 4/4, basically, this thing is like a Cloud Elemental with Suspend on it. Not with Suspend, with Rebound on it, I guess. And maybe not that, but you get what I'm saying. It's 5 mana for 4 power in the air. But it's even better than like a card like for instance, like I'm sorry, not Cloud Elemental, Air Elemental, because its body is separated. Removal is not effective against it, and it can chump just a bunch of things. So you can generally always find a situation where Lingering Souls is going to be a boon to your play. Thalia, Heretic Cathar. Card is phenomenal in most matchups, with the exception of possibly control, unless it's like multiple color control. Against mid-range, this thing is just a house, especially multicolor mid-range. When their fetch lands are coming into play tapped and they're waiting like 2 turns to get a land out of their deck, this thing's just epic level. When their creatures are being played and they're tapped and you're just racing them, and they basically, cannot block anything unless they're casting flash creatures and then like attacking the following turn. Like they really, it's tough to get around this card outside of killing it. Even in aggro, it's not bad because against like White Weenie, like this thing is a first striker, which means it's more relevant blocker and attacker, and it also allows you to kind of out-tempo them once you get to the mid-game. So very strong card. Liliana the Veil. So this card is not great against aggro, but is pretty much good in every other matchup. Against control and combo, it just destroys their hand. Against mid-range, it generally allows you to get like their one threat on curve. And then you can start knocking their hand apart and playing your own threats out. And ideally, you get 2 creatures with it and like 1 card out of hand against mid-range. Against control, you just go ham with this thing and keep on pushing +1 on it until their hand's gone. You can even play creatures into their counter magic because if they're countering stuff, that means they have less cards in hand after Liliana's just destroyed it. It'll tend to mean they miss land drops if they have not developed their mana base to that point. And, outside of finding their like 1 to 2 big threats or good threats, Liliana's probably just going to beat them unless they find an O-Ring, Vindicate, or something along those lines. Liliana, the Last Hope. So this card is in a weird place. I actually think in this deck, in the meta we're currently in, it actually may be more versatile than Liliana the Veil, which I know is heresy because Liliana the Veil is a better card. But this card shines against aggressive decks, which are very big right now, which Liliana the Veil does not really do for you. She basically just like kills each one creature, like not a good creature, and then like dies to their follow-on attack. This card kills a threat, but goes up in loyalty, and if you have supporting blockers, it tends to stick around for longer. So I like this card a lot against like the aggressive matchups. Against mid-range as well, it's close to power parity with the Liliana because it allows you to kill mana dorks, and then the -2 ability is actually pretty big in the mid-range matchup because like you're going to be trading 1-for-1 removals, and this card right here can just bring a threat back that they use the removal on, and at that point it's achieved a 2-for-1 advantage even if it dies on the following turn. So it's pretty powerful. Where this card does not shine, despite what some people may argue is false, is against control. I got it. Like, this card can eventually just hose control because it gives you an emblem that like just means control can never win. However, like the likelihood of pumping this thing to 7 and beating control with the ultimate is pretty low. That's just a long time. It's a lot of pumps. I mean, it's like 4 turns worth of pumping the thing. If it works, yeah, it's going to win against control, but more than likely it's not going to. So you're more than likely just using this thing to like plus it, and then when they wrath, minus it, get some threat back, play the threat out, force them to remove it, or wrath again. While you're plussing this thing up, -2 it. It's still great, but I just think that the pipe dream of the -7 ultimate is fairly slim. Have I had it happen? Yes, like 2 to 3 times, maybe 4 times against control, but it tended to be in games that I was probably already going to win regardless. It just sealed the deal on it. Tireless Tracker. This card is asinine. I know it sees play in some vintage or in some Eternal decks now, in some Legacy decks. Plays in Modern. Was a house in Standard. This card is just ridiculous. So, it basically says landfall, draw card. And it grows. You get a clue every time you play a land. With fetch lands, that's two cards, essentially, at the rate of 4 mana, but it's better rate than James Day Tome. But the other thing is, it grows itself, so the thing just gets out of hand relatively quickly. If you land this thing against control, you're going to win. If you land this thing against mid-range, they don't remove it before you get, a couple clues, you're already up. The only place it doesn't shine as much is against aggro, especially if it's like a red aggro where they can just remove it right away. It tends to be that I want to play this actually more as a 4-drop because I tend to want to get value out of it right away if I expect my opponents on a removal-heavy deck. But it's still very powerful. Probably one of the most powerful 3-drop creatures we have. The next one is kind of similar in the fact that I can generally consider it a 4-drop because I want to land this thing and get value out of it right away, get like a land off the top of my deck or whatever. The life gain is not irrelevant either because it allows you to race a little bit better, and the 2/4 body, the giant spider body, is generally very good because it allows you to shore up the aggressive matchup. It passes the bolt test, and in the mid-range mirror, it allows you to make some pretty decent blocks. This is another all-star, so when I was talking about Tireless Tracker, the thing houses control. This card houses control. Tireless Tracker probably houses control a little more than Courser of Crufix does, because you're drawing literal cards with Tireless Tracker, obviously at the exchange of mana. But against control, it tends to be that, you want to force them to use their mana inefficiently, i.e. Wrath of God to destroy one Tireless Tracker that's already drawn 2 to 3 cards and probably left behind 3 to 4 additional cards. It's just not good for them. Vindicate, just a very powerful and versatile removal spell. The fact that it can hit lands just makes this thing through the roof ridiculous. Very, very powerful card. There's sometimes I don't want it because it's just too slow, but because of its versatility, I think it's worth inclusion in the deck. Kolaghan's Command, this card is ridiculous as well, and good pretty much in every matchup. Against aggressive decks, it either tends to get their last most relevant card and kills one of their best threats, or kills their best threat, gets you back a threat that they have killed, in some other way. It can also destroy artifacts. It's not irrelevant because, their swords and batter skulls are a thing in this format. So it tends to be a very powerful effect as well. So none of the modes on this are bad, and they tend to be good in every single matchup you play. Maelstrom Pulse, again, kind of like Vindicate, obviously a little less powerful, probably a little easier to cast, although this deck is base Abzan in mana and in Color Pie. But this thing just answers anything. Planeswalker, anything but a land. Planeswalker, enchantment, artifact, creature, you name it, it's going to go away. Kitchen Finks, just a great card in every matchup again. So against aggressive decks, you gain some incremental life. You can trade it for a 2-for-1 advantage against other creature threats, small creature threats. In mid range, same deal. It allows you to race. It abates racing situations. Can race very effectively. There are some combos in the deck involving like Anafenza and some other counters that Dramoka's command that allow you to get even greater advantage out of this card. And against control, it has wrath proofing. So if they wrath this thing, it's like, okay, well, I'll gain 2 additional life and I still have a 2/1, which means you spend a card to just deal with half of my card. So it's still pretty good there. Knight of the Reliquary. This card is just a bomb. Just a ridiculous card. It was played, originally in like Maverick style decks, but the ability to find like any land you need, including the man lands out of this deck, just make this thing ridiculous. And it gets huge so fast that it allows you to end games just by attacking with it. Luxodon Smiter, this card is interesting because it's good in every matchup because again, like a 3-drop 4/4 is huge. It's just a big body. So against aggro, it's not bad. Against mid-range, it can tend to race fairly well. And against control, not being able to be countered is pretty damn good. And, discard, like random Lilianas, like Liliana just, puts this thing into play, is pretty epically good. So the card is nuts. Miri Weatherlight Duelist. So this card is really only good in the mid-range and aggro matchups. It's not a good card versus control. But the fact that essentially it says, your opponent can only attack you with 1 creature and they can only block with 1 creature whenever this thing attacks means that you'll pretty much always win racing situations. And this thing has first strike, which is also relevant. So like 3/2, I got it, does not pass the bolt test. But the fact that if they have, utilized their removal on your earlier drops, this card can just like outrace anyone. So like against like let's say White Weenie, which is a common meta choice by a lot of players in the 100 card format, you attack in, this thing doesn't die on the attack. They can only attack you with one of their likely multiple threats on their side. And they can only block you if you've developed your board with one of their threats as well. So whenever this thing is tapped, it's very good against aggressive decks. I suppose Goblins would be a similar argument. If this thing's tapped against Goblins, they can only attack you with one thing, which means that horizontal grow style strategies like young pyromancers of the world, or goblins, or humans, or just you name it, sapperlings, squirrels, doesn't matter. But the ability to force them to only block or attack with 1 card if this thing's tapped is just ridiculous. So I thought it was worth inclusion. I wanted to try it, and actually in one of the matches I'll show you at the end of this to kind of encompass some of the change in the deck, I'll show you that the card worked very well in the mirror. Renegade Rallier, again, a new card I'm trying out. The card, I replaced Eternal Witness with this card because I think this card is probably just a tiny bit better in this deck. I think Eternal Witness is a better card, more powerful card. But this card right here can attack with a lot more force. And the fact that it brings it back into play, whatever it gets, if we hit Revolt, is highly relevant. And there's a lot of two and less cards in this deck. Oftentimes it's just getting a fetch land back. But, sometimes it's getting back, a threat like a Tarmogoyf or a Grimflayer or a Putrid Leech, or you name it, which makes it very powerful. Or even like a Bitter Blossom, gosh help people if that happens. Alright, so, and the fact that it attacks for 3 is not irrelevant. Anafenza, just huge, just a big butt attacker, can't be bolted, pumps up your other guys when you're attacking. Just ridiculous. Races almost anything, and it's pretty much good in every matchup because control is going to have a harder time countering this, especially if you get one of your mana dorks and you're able to cast under counter magic on the play. It's just huge and it clocks people quickly. It's not irrelevant either that it completely hoses like aristocrat style decks or reanimator decks because their graveyard is not going to have creatures in it. Doran. A lot of folks debate this card, but because my build is a lot more aggressive and seeks to end games more rapidly, this card is great. There's a couple non-bows in the deck that have higher power than toughness. This guy kind of nukes a little bit, but the fact that he basically enables you to race cards like Ball Lightning or like Thalia, Heretic Cathar on the opposite side, or Thalia, like any white card that basically says 2/1 on it is kind of nerfed by this because they instantaneously become 1-power attackers, which means they're infinitely worse. He also is tough to kill and blocks, so I've been very happy with Doran. I think he allows you to race, and his reversal of damage based on power and toughness has actually almost been like a death and taxes like effect against the more aggressive decks of the format. So he's set up to race, and like I said, this deck is more aggressive in nature, but it is a switch deck. So I have cards that can generally tend to allow me to do either, but I want them to be able to race as well. So they're the most efficient, beaters that can get under counter magic and on their own win games against control. All right, so the Planeswalker package, the big Planeswalker package, Elspeth, Knight Errant. This card does everything. If you can land it against control, it's good. Generally speaking, they're going to counter it. Where it doesn't shine is against aggressive decks because it tends to be a little late to show up. But against mid-range, it owns the matchup. You just beat them down in the sky. It essentially can be looked at as a 3-power haste creature in a lot of cases because you're going to play this thing and fly over the top of their ground-based blockers and just deal them whole swaths of damage. Or you can just put 1/1s down and play the control role and just chump. So either way, it's good. Gideon, kind of the same idea. He can either chump or he can just smash face for. He's 7 power the turn after he comes into play. Think of him as like a 7 power 4 mana card. That is ridiculous. It's just a lot for a very little. And I've actually made the emblem before. That's not bad in this deck. Generally doesn't tend to be the go-to, but it's not bad with cards like Bitter Blossom or some of the other tokens. Chandra, so she can be played under a Blood Moon, which is great. Come on, Moto. She can be played under a Blood Moon. She is straight up card advantage. If we find lands, we probably don't want them at the point we're casting Chandra. She can make mana, which I've actually done in this deck, generally only on the turn she comes into play. And her ultimate is just a beating. The -3 is actually not bad either because sometimes you just need to play control and you just need to kill something that you just need to kill something. So you can either attack into them or you can block whatever they have on the counter swing. But typically speaking, you're just going to plus her. If once you may minus her the first turn. So I rarely plus her on the turn she comes into play. I either make mana with her to cast some follow-on threat, or I -4 or -3 her to kill some threat. After that, it's always going to be plussing. Because eventually if you get to -7, that just ends games, more assuredly probably than the Liliana the Last Hope does. Garruk Wildspeaker, card's a bomb. It's against control. If you get this thing down, it makes its own threats. Eventually it pumps its own threats. It is a mana efficiency engine, so it's just a beast of a card. So really, really a big fan of it. Falkenrath Aristocrat plays around Wrath effects. Not bad against control. Great against mid-range. Blanks lifelink because you just chump block for the lifelink, some other threat, and then sack it to the Aristocrat so they don't gain life. So it allows you to race very efficiently. Obviously a non-bow with cards like Doran, but I tend to find that even the sack outlet against like decks that run cards like Batterskull or Wormcoil Engine, or heaven forbid, a card like I can't think right now, guys. Baneslayer Angel, which is really rare nowadays, but is not a card that is not seen in play. But this card just does a lot, and it kills very fast. Bloodbraid Elf, probably one of the worst fours, but very good against control. Frankly, not bad in any given matchup, but just not phenomenal. It's a 3/2, which is a small body for 4 mana, but if it finds removal against aggro, it's good. If it finds another body to block against aggro, it's good. In mid-range, same story. If it finds removal, great. You can knock out, you can Maelstrom Pulse a Planeswalker or a threat, or tokens if you have a bunch of, Elspeth tokens or something on the board, and you want to Maelstrom Pulse them. Can find discard. So it's basically, and it plays around counter magic. So basically, this card, is just a very value-based answer against control, and it's also good in every other matchup. It's just a little inefficient for the price. I would like a slightly bigger body. Huntmaster of the Fowls, flip card here. If you're not familiar with Huntmaster, this card is a bomb. So it comes in 4 mana for 4 power. You get a 2/2 plus this thing's body. If they don't cast a spell, it becomes a 4/4, kills a smaller threat, and also domes them for 2. And then it tends to be very easy in this deck to flip it back over because our spells are so efficient. So you flip this thing once or twice, and you're probably winning the game. Johnny, just a beating. Against control, this thing is a slow, impending clock that will eventually one-sided Armageddon their lands. It also keeps their mana tapped, which means they're less efficient to cast spells. The 3 damage against Red Deck Wins or White Weenie tends to allow you to race very, very well with it. The card's just a bomb. Alright, so Queen Marchesa. This card is also just a massive bomb. Against mid-range, it's stellar. Against control, it's stellar. Against aggro is really the only place it doesn't shine. But you can generally tend to get to board states where eventually it's even going to be good against aggressive decks, and you can start getting advantage out of it. Monarchy is just a busted mechanic. Essentially one-sided Howling Mine with the draw being on end step is just stupid. And, there's times I even play this out into an aggressive deck knowing they're going to steal Monarchy, but because I'm going to get a 1/1 Death Toucher, I'm fine with it because I'm getting an additional threat, plus I know I'll get this thing back. Against mid-range, that tends to be a sure bet, though. I will generally attack into mid-range decks, knowing that they're going to be able to block, I'm not going to be able to block them effectively, just to get the 1/1, because the 1/1 tends to trade up against mid-range threats. So, anyway you look at this card, it's very good. The only decks tends to be bad against are decks like Red Deck wins, where they have a lot of haste creatures, or like a blue-white flash deck or something like that, where they could just attack you out of nowhere. Siege Rhino, the thing is just ridiculous. This is probably one of the most busted creatures. I guess Marchesa is more busted, but this card, in a core set, this is one of the more busted cards that have been printed. Not a core set, I guess they don't have those anymore, but in a standard expansion of Magic the Gathering cards, this is one of the most busted creature cards I think that's seen publication in a long time. So far be it from me to not exploit, a card that is essentially size massive for very little mana, and also just wins races. Gaining 3 life and draining them for 3 life is just a huge swing. This may be the dumbest creature card I've ever seen printed in Magic the Gathering. I'm going to show you a game where it just basically just almost kills an opponent in one hit. This card is dumb. Vigilance, Haste, and essentially double strike to all your creatures. It's just stupid. Given its mana requirements are very heavy, it's very difficult to cast. Not in this deck with a bazillion fetch lands and perfect mana fixing, basically, outside of getting Blood Mooned. But this card is nuts. It's just ridiculous. If this thing hits them once, they're probably losing. And the fact that it can block because it has Vigilance is just ridiculous, because a 3/4 is not a small body. Bolt can't kill it. It tends to be able to block 2/1s or X1s pretty effectively and just allow you to win races. Again, you can see the race theme. I've designed this deck to either, outvalue control players or race aggro players very effectively. So as you hear me talking about the deck, you'll see that's a common theme. Shriekmaw, just exceptional value, or early turn interaction for a threat that you can't beat. But if you're hard casting this thing, you tend to be doing very well, because it's essentially an unblockable 3/2, and it gets rid of their best thing that you're able to get rid of with it. Thragtusk, another very dumb card that was printed in a core set. I think we all know why it was printed. It was printed primarily to beat Delver. And I'm trying to think of the other card it beat. I think it was primarily Delver. This card just hosts Delver. This thing plus the Restoration Angel in its standard set was just the most disgusting thing ever. Can you imagine, attack them for 5, Restoration Angel this thing, on their turn or your turn, get an additional 3/3, gain 5 more life, attack again for 11 points of damage, plus you're up 10 life. Just a silly card. Good in every matchup. Against control, really the only sure way they have to deal with it is countering it. If you set up a situation where they are unable to counter it, then this thing's wrath proof. There's really no way outside of 2-for-1ing themselves to get rid of it and not get a 3/3 or get some value off it. Tasker the Golden Fang, essentially another impersonator of Tarmogoyf. The activated ability is not irrelevant in this deck, but I don't tend to use it. It tends to be that you're trying to win the game so rapidly that it becomes irrelevant. Against control, that it is slightly better though. And it can tend to win some games from that. But the 4/5 body is really what you're trying to get out of this thing, and the fact that it costs probably 1 mana in this deck. Green Sun Zenith, because why not? We're playing primarily green-based threats. Outside of this deck not running Dryad Arbor, so never cast it for 0 in this deck if you end up playing it. But some of our best threats are green. One of the most common cards I get with this, it tends to be this to win, because it just wins the game on the spot. I have gotten this not to lose. This right here is a card engine. I tend to get it if I'm playing against other mid-range decks and I'm not in a racing situation. I get Courser of Crewfix as a card engine if I'm in a racing situation or against a very aggressive deck where I just need to get some life. Kitchen Finks, generally speaking, just not to lose. That's the only reason you get that. And then I have gotten some 2-drops before. I've definitely gotten Kasali Pride Mage to stop, like an artifact I can't beat. From the board, it can get Reclamation Sage, which is actually in there. And then sometimes I get a Mana Dork as well. If I get a Mana Dork, I tend to be getting this guy right here. But those are the common targets. I have gotten Thragtusk with it before. But I don't think that's the most powerful use of it, just because it's so mana intensive to do it. And this deck is really just a model of efficiency, is kind of how it's trying to win games. And when we show you the games, you'll kind of see that's how the deck wins, is just through sheer efficiency and card quality. Just being good stuff deck, basically. All right, so sideboard. Burton Forge Tender, still in the sideboard. It tends to hose Price of Progress, which just completely kills us. The only main deck way we have of dealing with Price of Progress is just gaining a whole boatload of life or using Dromoka's Command. So this card is good to shore that up. And it's also just very good against red deck wins. Dark Blast, good in the mid-range. So it's a flexible card. Good against red deck wins. Well, I'm sorry. Okay against red deck wins. Very good against White Weenie, and very good against like green-based mid-range decks or the Mirror, because we can knock out their mana with this card and continue to do it. Deathmark, decent against White Weenie, very good against white or green X mid-range. And it probably has some other matchups out there that are pretty good. It's just a flexible card. Inquisition, bring it in against the aggressive matchups, and sometimes depending on the matchup, control, and sometimes against mid-range. So this card's flexible, but I tend to find that it hits less, and it's not a very good late-game pickup, so I don't want to main it anymore. Forked Bolt, good against White Weenie, good against Green X that has a lot of Mana Dorks in it, and not bad against red deck wins because it allows you to build up your graveyard and also just trade, 1 or 2 for 1 with their threats, their creature threats. Grim Lavamancer just hoses White Weenie, not bad against red deck wins, good against like just small creature-based decks, so like Green X, the blue, like the mono blue, like Merfolk decks, not bad against either. So blue's back in a big way, so Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast are back in to stop nonsense like Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, True Name Nemesis, which is a tougher card to beat for this deck, and Jace the Mind Sculptor. Just good blue cards, or just protect my best threats. Alright, Winter Orb houses control. Like, this card has been housing control since 1993. So there's not much they can do. Like, if they tap out for like to counter your stuff and you play this thing, it's like, alright, game over. Like, I just won. It is kind of an I win card. Golgari Charm. This card right here stops True Name Nemesis, stops enchantments, which is relevant because it gets back to basics. It gets Blood Moon, and it gets Moat. I'm trying to think of some other ones. Sulfuric Vortex, Humility. It's wrath proofing because it regenerates your stuff. So it's a very flexible card. Shines the most probably in control, but I also sideboard it in against some aggressive matchups that I know are going to have land hate. Reclamation Sage, good versus the land hate. Also gets Batterskull, swords, all kinds of stuff. It's a little bit of a small body, so that's why we don't main deck this card, even though I think it is a very good value card. And in a slower meta, I would main deck it. Timely Reinforcements just houses aggro decks. Against White Weenie, they play on a threat, attack you once with a threat. You play on a Mana Dork, they play on threat number 2, attack you again with their first threat or their second threat. You play this thing out on turn 2 or 3, gain all that life back plus 2, have a bunch of blockers for their, generally speaking, bad threats or threats that are bad versus 1/1s. Just houses them. Against red deck wins, they're generally going to have more creatures early, so if you have this card in your opener, you can generally tend to shape your gameplay to gain a lot of value on it, where they burn, like no pun intended, burn through a bunch of burn spells, get your life total low, have like 1 to 2 creatures on the board, or 1 more creature than you do, and you play this thing, and you're like, all right, I can block your crappy creatures you have, and I just gained 2 of the cards you burned off. I just gained back essentially in efficiency. So in the matchups where this is good, it's extremely good. It's generally a 3 or possibly even a 4 for 1 advantage. Obstinate Baloth, I expected a more aggressive meta when I played this deck today. I tend to not have this guy on my sideboard, but he is very good versus decks that I know are going to be running discard, and also like Raven's Crime is a thing now because of Life from the Loam, so you can indiscriminately discard this and get a threat. Liliana is a thing, so you can discard this and you have a threat. And the life gain is actually really good against red deck wins. So playing this thing tends to be a 3 for 1 against them because you gain life back, equivalent of 1 to 2 cards. It forces them to burn this thing off in conjunction with probably a bad attack or a bad block from one of their threats. So it's just very good against a lot of matchups, and it's not bad versus White Weenie. Thrun, like I said, blue's back in a big way. Thrun, despite being a pet card of mine, one of my favorites, Even though I know he's not like that great, he's just cool. Like he's a very cool card. This guy is just a house against blue or like Wrath.deck. You just play this guy out and you're like, all right, can't counter him. All right, I'm just going to keep on chipping into you until eventually you have to do something. And then when you do something, I do a bunch of things and kill you. That's kind of how I tend to play him out. He's just a very good tempo-y card against control. So that's the deck tech. I'm going to go on a quick pause, guys, then I'll take you through the matches. All right, guys, back. This is going to be our event. I think this is Chainsaw Massacre 4.19. So we're playing 4-Color Blood again, and this first matchup is not one that we were expecting. So we took Choke out of the sideboard. It's a card I definitely would have wanted in this matchup. My opponent, as it turns out, is on... so I know he's either going to be on White Weenie. I believe he will either be on White Weenie or Fish, Mono Blue Aggro. So I think this hand is keepable against either of those two matchups because of a couple things. One, I have Mana Acceleration, and I'm on the play, which means that on my turn 3 or turn 2, if I draw a 3-drop, I can cast it, or I can play around Daze if he's on blue and cast out my most relevant threat, or the threat that I would most prefer to have removed, which in this case is Sylvan Advocate. And I feel like with the fetch land, I have the flexibility to find the mana I'm going to need if I draw any other land for Zealous Persecution, which is going to be really good in either matchup. So I'm going to be able to fuel my graveyard as well with this hand, and probably get a Tasker down on turn 3 or 4 is my expectation. So I think this is an easy keep. So the funny thing is I actually take the damage here because I actually want to draw land, and I also don't know what I want to fetch with the Wooded Foothills. So I think saving the Wooded Foothills is actually smart here. Play out my Mana Dork and say, all right, go. Even though I know the 2 damage is not a great thing to take in this matchup, which I now know is Mono Blue, which I'd prefer to face, actually. Give me 1 second, guys. Got a text coming in. All right, guys, back. So I am fairly certain that he's on Merfolk at this point. I do draw into a black-green land, so my patience with the fetch land is paid off here. And I now know that I need to get a white source with the Wooded Foothills, which is either going to look like a Savannah or a Plateau would be what I can get with that. So, at this point in time, I'm going to cast out the Sylvan Caryatid, leaving up the Fintorn Elves, not attacking, to play around like, I don't know, a Force Spike. I don't know if he runs Force Spike or not, but he could. Chip in there for 1 after resolving our spell. I think that was proper to play our creature threat out main 1. Our opponent takes some card disadvantage here for some tempo, although I don't really care for this line. I don't like Snap in this matchup. I think Snap's just bad actively because he's down a card, and despite the fact that he has now freed up counter magic, I have the ability to play multiple spells in a turn, and realistically, he also needs to get a threat down, because his deck can't really play control until it has an aggressive element. It's an aggro control deck, it's a tempo deck, which I'm all about, because my deck is pretty much like a pure tempo deck. Like, it can play pure tempo if it needs to. He gets a free card off the card that he ditches a card and gets a free card off of the Silvergill Adept, but Silvergill Adept is not doing much against our threats. So this is possibly a slight misplay, but I'm doing this for like the highest upside here. So what I do here is I actually do not Zealous Persecution before I attack, knowing that my opponent can block, get basically a free block on the Scavenging Ooze with no creatures in the graveyard. Because the real high upside is that they double block the Goyf, which they're probably not likely to do, but I give them the chance to make the mistake. And if they do that, then I can just blow them out, like just destroy their Coral Helm Commander and kill their other threat. If they don't, then I'm kind of stuck in an embarrassing situation where I just, pop the Zealous Persecution mid-combat, don't do the damage from the Scavenging Ooze, and dome them for an additional damage off the Tarmogoyf, but get rid of their Silvergill Adept, and then on the second main, cast my Sylvan Advocate out. Not playing around Daze, however. So we have to eat a humble pie there. They block appropriately. Play on a Lord. At this point, with them tapped out, I just go ahead and I believe Vindicate here, blowing up their more mana or their less mana intensive Lord. Coral Helm Commander's going to require them to pump some mana into it, which is not good for them. They make an interesting block here. I guess they didn't realized the Findhorn Elves was still up, or they thought it was something else or whatever. Because we killed the Silver Gill Adept and the other Lord, I just, exile that with the Scavenging Ooze, and their block makes utterly no sense because I just eat their other Lord and get in there for, 6 damage. They're dead on the following turn, so they go ahead and pack it in here. So, that was game 1. Now, game 2, they're bound to have back to basics, which is like their silver bullet against me if I don't have an aggressive start. This hand is interesting. So this hand is not aggressive, which is kind of risky because I know that they're going to bring in back to basics, which is a risk for this hand. However, I do have Abrupt Decay to deal with that, plus any early threat. They suspended Ancestral Visions, which, is not great for us because we don't have really any good threats to force their action. But it tells me a lot about their hand. It lets me know, one, their hand's not as gas rich as it possibly could be because they're hanging that and they're down a card for multiple turns until they can draw those cards. And I've drawn decently well and gotten this Dark Blast. So, any small threat they play, I'm going to be able to deal with. And any large threat, I can possibly Liliana the Veil at some point. Inquisition's a phenomenal pickup. So I go ahead and Inquisition them. We get Mana Leak. That's whatever. That's kind of like, that's fine with me. So, they play on a Sig. I just go ahead and kill their Sig with Liliana. I figure the coast is clear with them on 1 mana to go ahead and Liliana them. Now, if they have Spell Pierce, that sucks. But I'm not going to play around that. I think it's worth it's not worth playing around a Singleton in their deck, and I don't want to give them the advantage through allowing them to have a Sig, which can draw them many cards. So we each discard a card. I believe I discard the Dark Blast, if I'm not mistaken. No, the Razor Verge Thicket here, because I still have my land drop. Let me push play again, guys, my bad. So I discard the Razor Verge. They discard, I forget what, a land. Their deck plays a lot more lands than ours does. I think their deck is close to a 40-land deck. I play on a 2-drop and say go, leaving up the Abrupt Decay to play around back to basics. They do get to draw 3 cards here, 4 cards with their draw step. And at this point, they go ahead and cast out essentially what I would call a kicked Silvergill Adept. I just Dark Blast it because I want the way to be clear, and I don't want that thing on the board because I want my Liliana to be capable of minusing effectively. I draw very well, and as opposed to playing out the Falconwrath Aristocrat, which I think is good, but not as good as Gideon, I cast out the Gideon. I could have gotten in for more damage this turn, but I think Gideon is going to give me more inevitability in the game, just due to how powerful. I mean, it's a 7-power attacker on the next turn. The Falconwrath is just 4 damage that turn, 4 on the next turn, which is 8, which is arguably more damage, but it's not quite good enough. So I do get the Dark Blast back, forced to sack. Opponent plays out their Snapcaster for no value. I Abrupt Decay it, destroying the Snapcaster, eating their True Name Nemesis, and essentially saying, hey, if you have back to basics, I don't give a crap. It's a time walk for you because I'm just going to, smash your face for 9 damage and put you to lethal on the following turn. They go ahead and Treasure Cruise here, which is a good card, but they need to play threats. They need to play blockers out. They play out a 3/3, which are 2/2, which is cool, but it's not going to win them. It's not going to keep them alive because I have this vampire held on to. They can block my 5/5, but they still take. I guess they are still alive, so they have to block, lose their threat. They're down to 3 cards and at 1 life. I guess there were outs. There were outs here, but not many, especially with Treasure Cruise already gone. Like their ability to draw multiple cards in a turn for a very efficient rate is very low. Bribery. And or treachery. Well, bribery would work. Treachery would not. Treachery cannot steal anything because I can just sack it to the Falconwrath Aristocrat. True Name Nemesis can't block on the ground. Well, he can't even get True Name. I guess if you get True Name Nemesis, I can still attack in the air. Yeah, there's no outs, I don't think. Like it would involve some weird dig through time turn, but they don't even have enough cards to fuel that effectively. So yeah, so we end up taking this one down. I think Merfolk is in a weird place. I think Merfolk tends to be really good against the blue decks, but really bad against the other aggro decks. And, my deck essentially can play as an aggro deck. I think at times this deck is actually a faster aggro deck than like White Weenie or Red Deck Wins. It's a lot more draw specific and a lot higher variance. Like it's not set to Goldfish as fast as either of those decks, but when it does, it's just, almost instantaneous. Generally, it tends to be via Saskia draws. So we're playing against Jeskai here. We see a Jace, which is not good news for us. So I want to pressure my opponent as much as possible and force them to react to me so that we're essentially taking them off counter magic. So we can resolve further threats to continue to essentially pile drive them into a tempo hole or a tempo sync, where they're forced to react to me every turn as opposed to develop their own threats. I assume they're on probably like some sort of Splinter Twin Kiki Jiki combo deck. But that's not entirely true. They could just be on like a Geist of St. Traft, like aggro control style Jeskai deck, which I tend to like better, but which is actually probably worse against this deck than like the Kiki combo style decks. So opponent does their thing with Jace, discards a Manus Rider, which is a good card. Don't have lands, interesting to me. They do kill my Manador, which is interesting because I think they'd rather kill the threat. I play out my Voice of Resurgence. Of note, I am short on white mana, so this Lightning Helix, which could stop the Jace, is not doing it here. We attack in. Go ahead and Lightning Helix this. Opponent plays out a Village Bellringer, which allows me to know, yes, indeed they are on a Splinter Twin Kiki Jiki combo deck, but it also gives me an additional 3/3, which is not horrendous. I would probably rather, in this case, kill the Jace, but that's not even necessarily true. Like a 3/3 is pretty damn good, and with Lingering Souls, it's bound to even be better. So they don't want to cast that on my turn, so they just flash it in right on their main. I draw into another threat, but I opt to actually play out the Tasigur here, destroying my graveyard. I obviously don't have attacks here, because Jace has -2'd my Elemental. Opponent brainstorms on their main, flashes back Brainstorm, doesn't find what they're looking for because they bottom here. So my assumption is they have not found the Splinter Twin or the Kiki Jiki at this point in time. I get the land that I very much so wanted, play out the Lingering Souls with flashback to make my Elemental token size enormous, and just attack their face. If they want to, chump block, they can. But that means they're not going to have like that threat. So that actually closes down. Like Kiki Jiki's the only card that wins in the game here on the spot. They bolt that thing and then just eventually they just concede. So they're like, I can't win. Game 2. And sorry about that wait, guys. Phone. Alrighty, so hand's good enough. Zealous Persecution is not phenomenal, but it does allow us to race. Play out our Tireless Tracker. We do lead on the Stomping Grounds because, again, I think I may want to play around Counter Magic and leave up Kolaghan's Command. I actually do leave up the Kolaghan's Command, which I think is the more powerful line because it allows me to deal with any threat they may play. And also allows me to deal with, there's a lot of things, like, for instance, like Stoneforge, this. Can't play around Daze and or Spell Pierce here, or Force Spike, but we get them. So they discard an Eldrazi Displacer, which means they're probably out of lands, and we get their Jace. Play out our Tireless Tracker and get a clue off of it, so we gain a little bit of value. Again, like I was kind of saying in the deck tech, treating Tireless Tracker like it's a 4-drop, because realistically, if you want to play that card right, you need to act like it is a 4-drop. So I make a more heads-up kind of play here, trying to see if I can get a mistake out of my opponent to gain a little more incremental value. I attack in with both my cards. It's a bluff, but it's not. People don't play a lot of combat tricks. I do blow that thing up because I don't want to lose my Tireless Tracker here, and my plan is to pump. I don't do it during combat because I want to leave my options open. It may be that I want to cast out the Gideon there, but in the face of Pia and Kieran Nalar, I really don't want to just expose a Planeswalker. So they cast this card, which is perfect. They tap the land, which is interesting to me because red mana is not the most essential mana. I end up just tapping it regardless to make mana, draw a card, and play my fetch land. And at this point, because I've already pumped, I opt to get a tapped land because I don't want to tap the Elvish or the Elves of Deep Shadow to draw an additional card. It's more damage just to attack there. I bang in there. Opponent, I believe, cast Hibernation at this point in time, so they're very reactive at this point. I play out this thing. It gets countered. I'm fine with this, though. Like, I just let it get countered because I'd rather just play out 2 threats because the Sylvan Advocate actually represents a lot more damage next turn. It represents lethal next turn if I draw a land, which is a decent chance of that. Draw to Taiga, lucky me. Fire up the Shambling Vent and say, hey, have it. Have an answer to it. They, I believe, play out the Deceiver Exarch, and they play it out kind of in a weird sequence where it doesn't really do anything. Not that it would have anyways. It would have just been blocking a card that killed it. So that is the game. Game 3 is against 4-Color Blood, and I'm going to go on a quick pause before we jump into that one, guys. Alright, guys, so our last matchup is in the mirror. This is a greedy keep, but on the draw, I think it's worth keeping. I do cast out the Birds of Paradise here. Say go. We're playing against an old version of our deck that we're playing right now. We don't hit mana, which sucks. So we've missed 2 land drops, which is not the best for us. If we miss another one, we're probably just going to lose outright. They don't appear to have a lot of gas right now, though. I play out the Goyf. I actually drew Mocha's Command to get rid of the Deathrite Shaman because that's the only card that really scares me here. Although it turns out that I probably wanted to play around to kill the Avid Mind Sensor, maybe instead. I don't know. It's not per se true. So they draw to their threat. I just go ahead and play on a Siege Rhino here because it allows me to block the Tasigur. And eventually it could become a threat if I can get rid of the Tasigur on the board. They bang in there for 3. Play out. So their draw has turned out fairly well for them. Like they're drawing gas. We draw into a card engine, which is fine and dandy. Obviously, I'm not going to cast out the Tide Hollow Sculler here. I'm just going to draw into more cards and see if my card engine can draw me out of this slump. Alrighty, so we cast out the Renegade Rallier to gain a little bit of value, get back the Birds of Paradise, which we assume we'll eventually block with. Alright, so we have to give them the Deathrite Shaman back. Alrighty, so play out the Tusk, gain some life back to kind of put us out of reach of this thing. Tell them, hey, you can chump one, or you can just basically block one, bounce them off each other. But if you want to block the other to gain value, you're going to have to trade a threat, a decent threat, or multiple small ones. I opt not to block there, because I think I may want red mana. That's kind of the crux. I think I may want red here. It ends up being wrong, I think. So they flip back. I pop a clue. And we die this turn. So what I end up doing is Kolaghan's commanding to get back my threat and destroy their Huntmaster of the Fells. It's really irrelevant what I kill. I could have killed the Avon, but if the Huntmaster flips, I'm going to die anyways because it'll blow up. It'll blow up my birds and it'll do 2 damage to me. So, and he can just attack because he has more threats. So, we lose this first one. The second one, actually, we should have lost, but our opponent has a pretty sizable misplay. So, this hand's good enough. We have removal for like an early dork if they keep a greedy hand. We have 2 removal. We have the Mind Sensor, which is very good against fetch lands. Although, they fetch twice in the first 2 turns, which is unfortunate because it means we're probably not going to get to use it. I go ahead and wasteland them here and just leave up the path, or plow rather. They play Tessiger. I just instantly kill that. I could have actually played the Raging Ravine out here, which may have been better. But I kind of want to be able to play a threat. I don't know. In retrospect, maybe I should have. I just attack because I'm not going to block that thing. Like, if they have removal, it's just so bad. Or if they have this, it's just so bad because I can't kill it, you know? So, I figure the likelihood of me getting to block that successfully is, like, extremely low. Draw Bob for the turn, which is a good draw, but I'm going to play this guy out. Old Chad here. I leave both back. I'm going to try to double block. It's probably folly, but it does mean my Gideon will get to stick around for a bit. Alright, we get Kolaghan's commanded, which is horrible. So, we're kind of getting beat up. Play out another 4-drop, but this means that we can put our opponent to 2. So our opponent does not block, which I do not think was right per se, but I don't know. We draw our own Tasigur here, play him out. And now we're kind of hoping to hit a land so we can gain some life and get a 5-3 threat down. They play their own Chad at this point, or Gideon as you were. We draw a decent card, a 4-4. We have to attack because if they continue to build up board presence, eventually we'll just get overwhelmed. And our threat that is larger than their threats is not going to be able to keep up. They play a Nissa, so their draw is just like a beating right now. Nissa does 6 to us, or the land does 6. So I end up double attacking. I attack with 2 cards here. I know I'm dead on the crackback. My opponent evidently does not. They have to block because they're dead to anything. So I think my opponent plays this exactly the wrong way. So like I have to get lucky. I have to have my opponent misplay, and I know it. So they have to activate their play is this. Their only card they could be playing around is like Fatal Push or Lightning Bolt at this point with the mana I'm showing and the 1 card in hand. But I think what their line needs to be is they need to fire up the Stirring Wildwood, untap one of the tapped lands they tap, likely the Razorverge Thicket or the Godless Shrine. Probably Godless Shrine is probably the worst land they have. Make it a 5-5 with the Nissa after untapping it, and then attack in with Gideon. So they come in with 10 power, one of which I have to block, and an additional 7 power, which means I'm actually dead on board here. They don't go for it, though, for some reason. They cast out this thing and just equip it, which is like the dead wrong play. I do draw the mana for Thragtusk, but because I've kind of set myself up to win if they make the mistake, I have the 2 additional damage because they don't have enough blockers to block all my threats. So like all it needs to get through is this Lava Claw reaches. So we eke out a win that I don't think was possible. I don't think should have occurred. It was just a misplay, like a huge time misplay. All right, so the last game we kind of handily owned them. Our deck's a little more aggressive than theirs is and a little more tempo based, which means they're probably better set up in the mirror. So they Green Sun Zenith for a card that I'm just going to kill. I do Swords to Plowshare this to keep my tempo up, because that's going to allow them to have additional mana on the next turn, and I want to slow their mana down. And just continue to present threats. So Thalia is a mirror breaker. She's what incentivizes playing more aggressive styles of this deck in the mirror over more mid-range style with more planeswalkers. Bang in there for 6. Play out the Green Sun Zenith. There's a consideration of saving it to get Saskia, but I'm not promised that I'm going to hit a land. And Miri Weatherlight. So this card is awesome in this matchup. The reason I love this card and like why I wanted to try it out is because I think it's so good against like horizontal swarm style decks and in the mirror because like he's only going to be able to block with 1 creature threat, and if this thing's tapped, he's only able to attack with 1 creature threat. So it decentivizes the use of the man lands because you can use it, but then you're not blocking with your biggest and best threat, and almost all of my threats kill a man land in combat. So they gain 4 life off of the Obstinate Baloth, which is a card I also boarded in, more so to play around Liliana. I guess I tapped poorly there because I could have possibly played out the Kasali Pride Mage. Of note, this hand is very choked on black mana right now, and that was a greedier part of the keep. They play out another Mana Dork, which is tapped, a card that I've long ago taken out of the deck because I think it's actually bad. I play out the Kasali and then just attack for lethal. I actually was getting ready to attack the Liliana because I thought that he had made my Thalia too small to kill him, but I have Xaxes on the crackback and I just kill him outright on turn 6 here. So that was the series of games we played over the course of Chainsaw Massacre 4.19. I did not play the finals, but ended up taking first place because I took a draw with Total Hate because there was really no point in playing it out. I was going to give him the prize pool regardless. I wasn't going to keep first place prizing if I won. So we go ahead and call it a draw. So in the 4-game set that we played, we had a draw and then 3 victories with 4-color blood. So I hope this helps you to kind of understand how this deck is intended to function. Why I've built it more fast as well, because like the blue cards are just so good now that you need to win quickly. You need to have the ability to win quickly, I think. So when you look at versions of the deck like Signalis is playing, which is an older version of the deck I'm currently playing, which is arguably better in the mirror, I think you tend to languish against control to a larger extent, whereas my deck is going to kill them very fast. And it has just the right amount of disruption, sideboard and main, to kind of slow them down. And when they're trying to cast a dig through time, they're just dying to whatever I have on the board. So that was the Chainsaw Massacre event 4.19. A very fun event. Had fun playing 4-Colored Blood. Kind of enjoy going back to the deck every once in a while and retuning it. And the deck still has what it takes. You don't have to play blue to win, and we kind of, I think, showed that today. And the deck did very well. And it's actually a very fun deck to play. Like, I enjoy playing it because it's an interactive attack deck. I'm not really one to play just an all-out attack deck. That's why, like, if I play white, I like to play like Death and Taxes, White Weenie, or a deck like this, which is a very aggressive deck, or can be a very aggressive deck, but also interacts. So it has a lot of decision-making involved in it. And I think solid play can tend to win you more matches than you'll lose. As long as you're playing it well, it'll definitely give you like a match-neutral kind of setting with the deck, outside of some pretty asinine draws. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and we'll be back next week, I think, with more. Unfortunately, the recording I was doing was lost. I wasn't recording half of it, actually, and I was just talking to a microphone. So I don't have the actual tournament itself, unfortunately, but what you get is this, which is a deck tech, and then some of my matches I played. Enjoy, guys, and take care now.